Live from Washington, this is a BBC News special on the rising tensions in the Middle East. Hezbollah confirms that one of its top commanders was among those killed in an Israeli strike on Beirut. The latest strikes come after 4 days of deadly attacks in Lebanon, including explosions of communications devices, prompting new condemnation from the UN Human Rights Chief.
It is a war crime to commit violence intended to spread terror among civilians.
We examine what the attacks in Lebanon could mean for the region, Israel's war in Gaza, and what may happen next. I'm Helena Humphrey, glad you could join me. We begin in Lebanon, where there are concerns tonight over escalating violence between the militant group Hezbollah and Israel and what it could mean for the region. Well, Hezbollah has now confirmed the death of a top military commander, Ibrahim Akil, after Israel struck a high-rise block of flats in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, on Friday. Ibrahim Akil is considered the most high-profile member of the group to be killed in the current conflict, with the US having had a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head. Well, Israel says that the targeted strikes killed around 10 Hezbollah military commanders. The Lebanese Health Ministry says that 14 people were killed and more than 60 injured. In response to the attack, Hezbollah has called the killing of Mr. Akil a crime and said that Israel will pay the price. Well, from Beirut, our senior international correspondent Orla Guerin has been reporting on the attack.
This footage captures the moment of the attack in the heartland of Hezbollah. The skyline looks like a city at war. Israel hit hard without warning in the densely populated residential district of Dahia, calling this a precision strike. The target was the veteran Hezbollah military leader, Ibrahim Akil. Israel said he had been eliminated, along with about 10 commanders of an elite unit.
At the time of the strike, Akil and the commanders of the Radwan forces were gathered underground, under a residential building in the heart of the Dahia in Beirut, hiding among Lebanese civilians, using them as human shields. They were in the middle of planning more terror attacks against Israeli civilians.
Akil had plenty of enemies. The US had put a $7 million bounty on his head, accusing him of involvement in the killing of Americans in Beirut in the 1980s. Day after day now, Hezbollah is being hit and being weakened by warfare from a distance. We were repeatedly prevented from reaching the scene by locals and the Lebanese army. Well, emergency vehicles have been coming and going. We've counted at least 10 ambulances coming up and down the road, going to pick up casualties. The dead are still being counted. There's a lot of anger here, a lot of tension. This was another major strike on Hezbollah here in its stronghold in South Beirut. Tonight, rescue workers still digging in the rubble for people who lived here. Among the missing, 4-year-old Naya Ghazi, a threat to no one. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Beirut.
And our international editor Jeremy Bowen has more on Hezbollah's response and the impact of Israel's strike.
Well, first of all, I can tell you that Hezbollah in Beirut have issued a statement now confirming that Ibrahim Akil is dead. A great jihadist, they say, a blessed life full of work, wounds, sacrifices, risks and achievements. So after a week of, exploding pages and radios, and now this raid on a meeting that the Hezbollah leadership clearly thought was secret in a basement in their stronghold in the southern suburbs of Beirut. I mean, they have had a disastrous week, and they must be wondering what else Israel has got in store for them. However, these remarkable tactical victories by the Israelis do not bring them closer to their strategic objectives, which is, first of all, to stop the fire across the border into Israel from Lebanon, which has in fact intensified, and to get 60+ thousand Israelis back to their homes in border towns, which have become ghost towns. There are more Lebanese, incidentally, on the other side who've had to leave their homes because of what Israel has been doing in return. So what's been happening this week, I think, is Israel trying to break out of the status quo and do some real damage to their enemies. Now, they've done the damage, but they haven't changed that status quo. And that's why there are fears that, and there's quite a bit of talk as well in Israel about the prospect of a military incursion by Israeli groups into Lebanon. And that is something that Israel's Western allies are against, but it may happen. And it's part of what is looking like a very dangerous slide towards all-out war in the region at really one of the most dangerous moments in the last 12 months.
Our international editor there, Jeremy Bowen. Well, Israel has been moving more troops close to the border of southern Lebanon, and Israel's defense minister has talked about what he has called a new phase of the war. Some 60,000 residents of northern Israel have left their homes due to the escalating conflict, from where our correspondent Paul Adams reports.
Today, if this had happened, say, a week ago, you might have thought, well, here is the latest sign of the menace that Hezbollah presents to the people of northern Israel, because there have been volley after volley after volley of rockets flying over the northern border. We were witness to a couple of those as we arrived here in Rosh Pinna, which is about 10 miles from the Lebanese border a few hours ago. There was a salvo of around 15 to 20 rockets that was intercepted right over our heads. So it's been a pretty spectacular day. Daniel Hagari, the chief Israeli military spokesman, saying that there had been as many as 200 rockets fired over the border. But they have pretty much all been dealt with. We have had no reports of any significant damage or injury. It seems as though Israel's air defense systems managed to cope with the threat perfectly well. And at the same time, we heard, the reports from overnight of attacks on a large number of missile targets in southern Lebanon, with the destruction of as many as 1,000 rocket barrels, according to the IDF. And then, of course, the news from Beirut. There are those who feel that this week a corner has been turned, that the Israeli government, which announced that the return of civilians to evacuated communities in the north was now one of its war aims, that it has stepped up a gear. It has shown the kind of resolve and determination that, frankly, people in this part of Israel accused the government of not showing for the past 12 months. And that, in a sense, I know this sounds kind of ridiculous, if there were any gloves on before this week, they have most definitively come off.
Paul Adams there in northern Israel. Well, Lina Khatib is the director of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London's Middle East Institute. She told us more about Israel's strategy in its conflict with Hezbollah.
What Israel is trying to do is prevent Hezbollah from using this military capacity by, for example, infiltrating its communications infrastructure and causing disarray within the organization. Let's not forget that an attack like the pager attack will mean that Hezbollah will now become suspicious about practically any equipment that it has imported.
Right.
And so this kind of chaos within a militant group like this is in a way more crippling than large-scale military action against it.
Let's take a look at the timeline of all of this then, because the latest strikes come after 4 days of deadly attacks in Lebanon, widely attributed to Israel, though Israel's not confirmed any role. Well, on Tuesday, handheld pagers, which were used by Hezbollah, exploded across Lebanon, killing at least 12 people and injuring thousands of others. Some people were being laid to rest. At least 20 more others were killed by walkie-talkies that exploded in a further attack on Wednesday. And several people in Iran and Syria also suffered injuries. Well, since then, both Israel and Hezbollah have launched strikes towards each other, including Israel's third targeted attack on Beirut this year. Well, MMXXIV is a senior fellow and senior director for outreach at the Middle East Institute, and he told me about how the latest strikes could escalate an already intense situation. I'd like to start with that strike that we saw in Beirut today, which Israel says killed Hezbollah commander Ibrahim Akil, has also been confirmed now by Hezbollah. How much does this strike, in your opinion, ramp up what, of course, already clearly is a very tense situation?
Oh, everybody in Beirut is not sleeping tonight, Helena. Everybody's on edge. Clearly, this is the most unanticipated of scenarios. In 3 days, back-to-back attacks, the pagers, thousands of people being rushed to the hospitals, overflowing hospitals, then the walkie-talkies the following day. And as we heard from Hezbollah's chief, Hassan Nasrallah, yesterday in his speech, a message was delivered to him through official and unofficial channels from Israelis saying, will you back away from that border or do you want more? And then this crippling attack today, almost decapitating Hezbollah's military leadership. To this hour, we're talking about 12 top Hezbollah commanders being taken off the battlefield. So this is, by every stretch of the imagination, taken both Hezbollah and the rest of the Lebanese by complete surprise.
So I wonder then, after those attacks which you mentioned, the pager attacks, the walkie-talkies, and now this, what does this mean for Hezbollah? Because clearly, you point out, Akil was a top military leader. Is the group weakened?
Very much so. I think the question is that, is it completely incapacitated? Hezbollah is no doubt a formidable military force. It's the most powerful non-state actor in the world. It has over 150,000 rockets. It fought Israel to a standstill after a month-long war in 2006. It is much stronger today than it was then. But the kind of exceptional strikes that we've seen in the past 3 days have definitely left it reeling. And I would argue that Hezbollah, even before the events of the last 3 days, did not have the appetite for an all-out war with Israel. It very much preferred a war of attrition, a border war that now has caused over 60,000 Israelis to flee their homes. So I guess after the strikes, the painful blows of the last 3 days, I really don't think that Hezbollah has it in it right now to contemplate an all-out war with Israel.
I mean, of course, we are waiting. As you say, Beirut, many people there not sleeping tonight. And it strikes me in having this conversation in recent months, many sides have been saying for a long time, nobody wants an all-out war. But I just wonder, when you look at the actions, for example, from Israel, when you look at the comments from Hassan Nasrallah, as you've pointed out, do actions actually speak otherwise? I mean, are we nearing a point of getting closer to that potential all-out war?
You know, I was one of those analysts who at some time ago believed that nobody really wants an all-out war. I'm not too sure anymore. I'm not too sure. I haven't been sure really since Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, decided to take out Hezbollah's chief of staff in the heart of Beirut on July 30th. Clearly here, Israel exercising escalation dominance, willing to risk all-out war, much more than Hezbollah or Iran are. So I think it is an open question at this point, but I do want to say that there's an unrealistic expectation on behalf of the Israelis as to what the strategic outcome of this war could be. You will not be able to stop that cross-border fire simply through a military solution in Lebanon. You will need to go back to diplomacy. But here's what I suspect the Israelis can do, perhaps the unstated or understated objective of this campaign. They can deal a severe blow to the crown jewel of Iran in the region. That ring of fire of proxies that Iran has surrounded Israel with, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, the various militias in Syria and Iraq. If you're able to significantly degrade and weaken Hezbollah, that is a significant achievement.
But here's the thing, I guess. How would it be that Hezbollah could acquiesce when, of course, we know its loyalties lie with Hamas and Iran? Doesn't it put that in a difficult situation?
And that's exactly the kind of gridlock that we're in. I do not see Hezbollah at all being able to decouple the Lebanon front from the Gaza front, despite the utter destruction and devastation that could be visited upon it and upon Lebanon. Simply put, from the day after October 7th, Iran and Hezbollah declared what they call as this unity of fronts, the entire Iranian axis in the region, fighting in sync and together from various fronts. For Hezbollah to decouple from Gaza would be to do away with that entire strategy and the unity of the Iranian bloc. So I simply don't see it as being capable of doing that, nor do I think their patrons in Iran would want to see that.
We've got about a minute left. Last question, a lot to pack in. I'm curious to the mechanics of what an all-out war could look like in your assessment. Are we talking about a ground invasion here? And something that you said that struck me was about Israel achieving its aims through that ground invasion. Of course, we know now that one of the stated aims is the return of residents to northern Israel. Can it do that through military means, or would this also require a diplomatic or political solution here?
You know, Helen, I had a sit down today with two senior American officials dealing with these issues on background, and I can tell you that the level of frustration in the administration is very high when it comes to Israel expanding that campaign. The administration had essentially pre-negotiated a deal that would see Hezbollah move a certain number of kilometers off the Israeli border. The Israelis would redeploy out of a couple of contested points along that border. And then there'd be an enforcement mechanism and a guarantees put forward by both the French and the Americans. But to achieve that, Iran and Hezbollah made that premise on a ceasefire in Gaza. And the administration was really trying to get both Yahya Sinwar of Hamas and Bibi Netanyahu past that finish line. Obviously, the entire American strategy fell apart. The ground component of an Israeli operation, I think that would be truly foolish of the Israelis to try and attempt. I think they're much better off trying to extract a lot of pain and to degrade Hezbollah in the coming days. But we're going to have to wait and see.
Well, the international response to these latest attacks has been growing, including from the White House, where during a cabinet meeting on Friday, President Biden was asked what this means for the prospect of peace in the region.
In the peace process, we're continuing to try to do what we've tried from the beginning to make sure that both the people in northern Israel as well as southern Lebanon are able to go back to their homes and go back safely. And the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, our whole team is working in the intelligence community to try to get that done. We're going to keep at it till we get it done, but we've got a way to go.
At a special meeting of the UN Security Council on Friday, several members condemned this week's explosions on communications devices.
But if things continue as they are, we risk seeing a conflagration that could dwarf even the devastation and suffering witnessed so far. It's not too late to avoid such folly. There is still room for diplomacy, which must be used without delay.
Well, the UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk said that he was appalled by those attacks, saying that they could constitute a war crime.
International humanitarian law prohibits the use of booby-trap devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. It is a war crime to commit violence intended to spread terror among civilians.
Well, Patrick Theros served as the US ambassador to Qatar from 1995 to 1998, and he shared his reaction to Israel's tactics. Let's begin by touching on those comments that we just heard there from the UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk, and he was saying that he was appalled by those synchronized explosions of those walkie-talkies, those pagers, which he said in his assessment could constitute a war crime. What do you make of the tactic being used here?
I think that there was actually a mistake on the Israeli side. It makes no sense to have this massive explosion all across the command sector of Hezbollah, and then there's no follow-up. I mean, this is the sort of thing that I would expect to be synchronized with moving tanks across the border in a full-scale attack. They clearly inflicted a psychological blow on Hezbollah, but psychological blows pass after a couple of days. So whatever advantage the Israelis might have gotten out of this will dissipate over the next few days. So I suspect and this is a personal opinion, but it's still it's rational. The Israelis, for some reason, felt that they were about to be discovered, that the bombs were there, and it was use them or lose them.
Well, certainly there have been questions about the timing.
Yeah, the timing makes no sense to me, because there should have been, I mean, this is the sort of thing you do just before the tanks start rolling.
I mean, what we did see today, of course, was those strikes, including on an apartment block in Beirut, leading to the killing of that top Hezbollah commander. And the administration's been speaking about this today, saying that it hadn't heard about this before it happened here in Washington. What do you think, watching this, the administration will be making of this particular moment?
I am particularly cynical at this point. I believe that this is not attempts by Israel to deter Hezbollah, but to provoke Hezbollah into an attack, into a retaliatory attack.
For what reason?
Israel feels that the United States would not support an Israeli-initiated attack into Lebanon. But if there was a Hezbollah attack on Israel, then the Israelis, I think, are reasonably confident that we would repeat what we did a few months ago with the attack from Iran, is that we would at least join the Israelis in shooting down missiles and shooting down rockets. Whereas if they started it, if the war began with a massive Israeli attack into Israel, then I think the Israelis are not confident that we would join in.
And of course, Washington has maintained that it is there for the defense of Israel. So should we see a further escalation, what do you think the prospects are? How far could the United States become involved?
It all depends on whether or not the Israelis are able to provoke Hezbollah into a large-scale attack. It's clear that the small-scale exchanges of fire that have been going on so far have not been the sort of thing that has caused the United States to start saying we have to get involved. Israel needs to get the United States involved. The Israeli experience in invading South Lebanon 3 times was a disaster each time. They created Hezbollah by doing so. Fighting guerrilla war against a well-armed, well-dug-in operator on the other side, adversary, is extremely difficult, and frankly, in each case, they don't like to use this word, in each case, the Lebanese defeated the Israeli and forced them to evacuate. So they need the United States on their side.
And of course, Israel continues to say that it's carrying out these operations to diminish Hezbollah following those attacks, which we saw in the wake of October 7th. We should say October 8th is when we started seeing those more rockets coming from Hezbollah. But of course, Washington continues to insist, and other Western countries as well, that there has to be this path towards de-escalation, a diplomatic path here. Do you realistically believe that that is on the table, particularly within the confines of the time that President Biden has left in office?
Not unless there's a dramatic change in politics in Israel. The United States essentially has a very few choices, since the Israelis are not amenable to the sort of diplomatic pressure, the repeated visits by Secretary Blinken. Essentially, what you need is an American action that will, in some ways, maybe bring down the Israeli government or get the attention of the Israeli government. And it all comes back to a ceasefire in Gaza. It doesn't matter what's happening. I mean, it does matter what's happening on the Lebanese frontier, but that depends on a ceasefire in Gaza. The Houthis depend on a ceasefire in Gaza. Everything that is going on right now is tied up with the ceasefire in Gaza, and has been repeated. Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire in Gaza. He can't afford a ceasefire because it would bring down his government, and then he would have bigger problems.
Well, let's turn now to some other important news around the world. Travis King, the American soldier who crossed into North Korea last year, pleaded guilty to desertion and 4 other charges as part of a guilty plea. He was sentenced to 12 months confinement. The US Army soldier was temporarily detained by North Korea last July after running across the demilitarized zone. The US Secret Service has admitted, quote, deficiencies in planning prior to an attempt on Donald Trump's life at his rally in July. An internal review of the security service concluded there were gaps in communication, complacency, and a lack of diligence ahead of the shooting on July 13th that injured the former president and killed a rally attendee. More than 70,000 people fighting in Russia's military have now died in the war in Ukraine, according to new research by the BBC. Working with the independent website Mediazona, BBC Russia has analysed the names of the dead published on social media in obituaries and official publications. They've discovered that more Russian volunteers are dying on the battlefield than soldiers. Schools in Niger will start the academic year almost a month late due to heavy rains and flooding. That's according to the military government. Many classrooms are damaged or are occupied with displaced people. Well, torrential rains since last July have caused havoc across Niger, and earlier this month, the Interior Minister said that almost 300 people had drowned or died when buildings had been brought down. Rescue operations are underway in northern Italy after flooding forced roughly 1,000 people to evacuate from the Emilia-Romagna region of the country. It follows torrential rains in Central Europe that claimed the lives of at least 24 people. The EU has pledged billions of euros in aid for Poland, Austria, the Czech Republic and Slovakia after the area suffered enormous damage from the flooding. You're watching BBC News. I'm Helena Humphrey. Thanks for your company. More on the way at the top of the hour. Join me then, if you can. Bye for now.
Hello, thank you for joining me, Tomasz Szafanaker, with your latest weather update. Let's see what's happening across South America first. We're going to see a very wintry picture across the Andes and southern parts of Chile in the coming days, with weather fronts moving through, some strong winds as well. To the north, across the tropics, heavy rain from Peru into Colombia, southern parts of Venezuela, but much of the Amazon basin is looking very dry. It has been dry for quite some time. The river levels are very low. That's not expected to change in the short term at least. And here's all that wintry, unsettled weather there across southern parts of the continent. Let's take a look at some city forecasts now. In Bogota, showers pretty much every day, temperatures hovering around 20 or so. Look at that temperature rise in Sao Paulo. We'll see a change in the wind direction, so the heat is on across central parts of South America. Further north now in the tropics, big storms from Panama through Costa Rica into southern parts of Mexico. The east of the Caribbean is looking relatively quiet over the next few days, but this is an area that we're watching here. A lot of storminess in the coming days, and in fact in the next week or so there at least is a 40% chance of a tropical cyclone developing somewhere in this region, so we're keeping a close eye on that part of the tropics. Havana looking pretty showery in the coming days, temperatures around 32 Celsius. Santo Domingo should be sunny in the next couple of days.